Welcome back to another episode of the Stigma podcast. Today's guest is Dan Housman. He's the co-founder and CTO of Courage Therapeutics. I met Dan in late 2020 when he came through our first cohort of the What If Fellowship program, and we got to work together on his startup and getting him ready to pitch investors and getting him in front of a bunch of investors. And his startup, Courage Therapeutics, is focused on eating disorders, anorexia nervosa specifically. It's a biopharma drug development business. And as I worked with Dan, I realized that this is a very stigmatized topic that is not getting enough attention. And there are not enough solutions in the market for people who suffer. And Dan is tackling that. So I am really excited to have him here today to talk to us, educate us, and tell us a little bit about what he's doing and where they are in their process of bringing a revolutionary solution to market around eating disorders. So without further ado, Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show, man.
Thanks for having me on, Steven. Glad to be here.
So Dan, can you tell me a little bit about Courage and talk to me about what you're working on in the eating disorder space?
Yeah, well, Courage is a discovery stage biopharma, and we're focused on building compounds that can impact diseases like anorexia nervosa. And the way we've gone about it is we've targeted a primary circuit in the brain that manages both feeding behaviors as well as anxiety. It's a circuit called the melanocortin system. And we're looking at this one receptor, which is called MC3R, the melanocortin 3 receptor, which was discovered to have this very strong activity to control the whole system by being able to suppress the other receptor that's been studied quite a bit called MC4R, which basically stops people from eating. It's the thing that if you turn on MC4R, you stop eating. And for people who can't turn MC4R on, they end up with severe obesity. And there's a number of diseases that cause that. But nobody has taken on the charge of looking at the opposite of obesity, looking at diseases like anorexia nervosa, ARFID, which is a disorder where patients are very picky eaters to the point to which they're malnourished. And we're basically just taking the opposite approach on the same receptor system that's already been successful in treating obesity. The success comes from a company called Rhythm Pharma, which just got their FDA approval about 2 weeks ago for a drug called setmelanotide. And setmelanotide activates MC4R, and the drug we've been working to develop will turn off MC4R. And so we've been at it for quite a bit. Started in 2019, although the research we're basing the work off of really has been going on for the last 10 years or so out of my collaborator and business partner, Dr. Roger Cohen's lab. And so we're really active at trying to bring drugs to market in a space that has very little attention right now, but is a very big unmet need.
So what drove you to solve this problem? Why is this important to you?
Yeah, well, I have a personal connection to anorexia nervosa. In my family, I have a daughter who has struggled since 2018, probably all the way back to 2017. And I really hadn't put much thought into eating disorders until she started struggling. And once we experienced it in our family, I found that it's obviously something that's biological in nature, not what I think a lot of people had thought before, which is that it's just teenagers acting out or some normal thing that could happen. In our case, our daughter went from being a pretty normal kid, eating maybe a bit of more of a rule follower than most, to shifting through the fall of 2017 from first, not eating her Halloween candy to second, not being able to eat turkey dinner at Thanksgiving, such that by the time we were at December of 2018, she really was down to eating an apple a day. And at that point, she'd become so rigid that there was nearly nothing we could do to get her to eat. other than take her to eating disorder clinics. At an eating disorder clinic, they couldn't get her to eat. And from there, she had to be hospitalized in Boston for 3 weeks on a nasal gastral tube. I'm telling you the story sort of at the top end to say, I don't think there's anything that's normal psychology that, with all of the interventions and the best science people have to push, would allow someone to refuse to eat for 6 or 7 weeks while in treatment. And so, I really believe this is a biological disorder that comes on at puberty. It's hereditary. In our family, my wife's sister also struggled with anorexia when she was younger. And my background is in molecular biology, although I've spent a lot of my career building companies focused around bioinformatics. And I took it on myself as a parent, as an entrepreneur, to go out and find the best science in the world to try and support my family as well as the hundreds of thousands of other families who struggle in the same way we do every year.
So, I mean, are there solutions out there for this, or are there no solutions out there, or are there solutions but they just don't work? I mean, what's the state of the solution set or the market for solving this problem?
Yeah. So the biggest debate that's gone on in eating disorders has been what's the right behavioral therapy? And so there's been a lot of effort to treat people with anorexia nervosa through residential treatments, through inpatient treatments, through cognitive behavioral therapy, through family-based therapy. And the conclusion of the only and best evidence-based therapy for eating disorders is family-based therapy, which means parents take absolute control with some support from clinicians to take care of their kid and force them to eat. And that's not a particularly effective answer from a clinical perspective, because it just says, you have to take all of this on to non-professionals to be able to deliver the care that someone needs to save their life. But there is also all of the rescue systems in place if that's not working. And so the other sort of state of treatment is all of these different levels of care to take care of people who have anorexia. And so, at the most acute level, it's hospitalizations that last somewhere between 8 to 20 days to do medical stabilization that usually get referred out into partial hospitalizations that take 6 to 20 weeks to, continued step downs from treatment, which often last a year with multiple relapses in that treatment pattern. Now, the pharmacological solutions that are out there are supporting in the background all of this somewhat effective solutions for treating patients. None of the pharmacological solutions are miracle cures. There's no insulin for anorexia nervosa. What we do have that is prescribed by psychiatrists are SSRIs, which are the drugs, things like Prozac, that provide changes in mood, usually to treat depression, because there's a significant amount of dysphoria and hopelessness and anhedonism. People don't feel happy about anything when they're in a serious state in anorexia. And SSRIs are also indicated to treat obsessive compulsive disorder. And so there's an attempt by psychiatrists to treat the obsessive compulsive piece of refusing to eat and significant fear of weight gain with the SSRIs. And I think some small percentage of people respond who have anorexia nervosa, but the majority of people benefit from some of the mood improvement. It doesn't really change the core behavioral problems of being afraid to eat and being afraid of weight gain.
So this drug that you're developing, it's kind of like an on-off switch for this receptor that controls our desire to eat. Is that a kind of a layman's way to say it?
I think so. In the layman's side, sure. What is tricky is that, as you know, if you were to stop eating for a few days, maybe even for a few hours, your behaviors would change quite a bit, right? You would start to become irritable and you would have limited patience, and your focus on food would shift to be the top priority in your world. Whereas someone with an eating disorder doesn't have those things in the same way. They find once they've been deprived of food to be anxiolytic. They feel relaxed and patient as though they're in a meditative state and as if eating would make them miserable. And so it's not just about the desire to eat, it's the overall function in that system of how it changes anxiety. And the word anxiety may even be too weak to describe what's going on. So it's not just I'm hungry, I'm not hungry. It's how do I feel about being not hungry?
So will this drug, do you see it functioning like an insulin, like a panacea for the problem, or will it be a drug that's used like an SSRI that is used in conjunction with some sort of behavioral therapy?
Yeah, well, certainly we're not far enough along to ever think we could have a panacea, but it isn't really our hope that we'll fix all problems. I think our hope is more like we would produce an SSRI for eating disorders that works. And even people who are on SSRIs are still in need of a lot of behavioral therapy if they have some kind of serious mental illness. So, we would be probably supplanting or supplementing the existing pharmacology that's out there, but we'd hope to reduce the reliance on these severe support systems, to reduce hospital stays, lower the amount of time people are in residential clinics, see that they're improving in terms of their eating disorder questionnaire scores about how they feel about themselves, lowering self harm. So we wouldn't be replacing all of the well thought out therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or family based therapy, but we'd be giving them a much better chance to work. In my experience, because we've been through in our family a good 2.5 year journey. And I can tell you for a lot of the time when we were involved in these family based therapy, cognitive based therapy, there's just very little interest by the person who's being treated in the therapy, which is maybe not unique to eating disorders, but these classes of disorders where the therapy itself is rejected by the patient make it really hard. And so if we can even just overcome improving the effective therapy, we'd be happy. There is another thing I want to note, which is while our primary aim is to improve the psychology, have people feel better about themselves and be able to move beyond obsessions over feeding and weight, the activity of these receptors also do control this thing called feed efficiency, which means if we give someone a certain number of calories into their body, we give them 2,000 calories, more of those calories will be retained in their body as muscle and fat when these receptors are active the way we're tuning them. And I bring that up because the primary goal of treatment today is to weight restore people. So if someone is 30 pounds underweight, they'll get discharged from treatment when they're 10 pounds above their ideal body weight. And if we had no effect whatsoever on the psychological effects of the eating disorder, just being able to accomplish that weight gain faster is really important because it both provides medical stability and there's a lot of theories, there's no hard science on it, that the improvement on total body mass and restoring the weight has a huge shift in the psychology, that your endocrine system recovers and shifts back into more normal modes, and the people with eating disorders aren't OCD as much. And so we do want to do all these things. It's still very early, but we have in animal models a lot of evidence that we can do these things. And the ones we have the most confidence in are the metabolic ones, because those really don't have anything to do with whether you're a person and have this complex human ego. Some just are related to how your body processes calories.
Right. And so you've done a lot of work here already. I want to kind of get a sense of where you are with drug development and I kind of want to start with, how do you know that what you're pursuing will work? I know you've done some work around that, so I'd like to have you highlight that. And then where are you in the development process?
Yeah. So the primary thing we have control over in testing is animal models. And so there's a couple key animal models that we've worked in. One is relating to whether an animal feeds in a 24-hour period actively and gains weight after the drug is given to them. And the other is doing similar things, but doing it with designer receptors such that we can stimulate the receptor regardless of where you have a drug. And so the early experiments to control feeding and control anxiety were done off of these DREADs, which are these designer receptors, which basically took the target we're hitting, MC3R, and wired it up in a mouse's brain so that we could synthetically activate it. And Dr. Cohn's lab has a couple of papers that showed that when this was done, the mice both had active changes in weight gain in that 24-hour and then further periods beyond it. And also when they were put in anxiety situations. And so there's anxiety test where an animal is put in a large open field, and they don't like to be in open field because they're afraid they're going to get eaten by a hawk or a cat or something. And so if they're less anxious, they'll spend more time in the center where there's a small amount of food. If they're more anxious, they'll only hide in the corners. And in testing with the DREADs as well as with the tool compounds we put together, the animals moved closer to the center and spent a lot more time in the center, showing that they had both reduced anxiety and reduced anxiety around approaching food. So to put that into context of where we are in drug development, those early experiments give us the tools that show if we can make a drug that can do what these tools do, then that drug will have these effects. And so we've been working to build the drugs that have the right properties to give to people. And those sorts of properties are they effective in a very low dose? Because increasing the dose always creates some kind of risk that it's going to hit other receptors or be picked up by the immune system. And can we do it in a way that will survive a long time in the body? Can we put it in the body and it's not gone in 10 seconds or it's not gone in a few hours? And so we've been optimizing the tool compounds to have those drug-like properties and doing a continuous process through. Now we're on to our fifth wave of testing compounds. And we've been able to go from things that were somewhat selective to the receptor we're looking for, somewhat potent, to very selective, very potent compounds. And our real next steps in the drug development process is to work on these things we call pharmacokinetic issues of how long do they last in the body and how effective are they at reaching the target now that we have all of the properties we want in those compounds. And we're tweaking them to be more drug-like as we go.
What's the timeline from now till when you're in a clinical trial, or when I guess you're putting the drug into humans? How far are you from that?
I think the realistic answer is we're 2 years away. And best case scenario, we're a year to a year and a half away. The big gaps are we still have to finish this optimization, which may even take 3 to 6 months. And then we have to do all of the work, which is preclinical studies and enabling studies and toxicology to be able to get ready to go into human. That means going up through a chain of different models all the way up to non-human primates, which is testing things in things very similar to a human to make sure all the effects we see in a mouse still occur in a primate and do it safely. Following that, there's a little bit of time after you register before you can put things into a human. So 2 years, if you look into drug development programs where we are, is a reasonable forecast of how long it would take to have that first human trial. But the risk has gone down quite a bit in terms of the question of can we make these compounds? And so that changes some of the expectations. We didn't know if we could or couldn't. We would have to say we were 4 years away, right? Because we'd still be shooting in the dark as to whether or not we can make drugs. Now we have to figure out how we can turn the drug-like molecules we have into something safe to put into a trial.
Is anybody else doing this? I mean, has anybody else worked on developing drugs for this problem recently or in the past? I mean, You talked about what the treatments are that are out there today, but it seems like there's not a lot of people working in this space. Is that a good assessment, or am I off there?
Well, I think it's a very weak field if there are people making drugs specifically in eating disorders. The drug I didn't mention when I was talking about available drugs on the market, olanzapine, which is a atypical antipsychotic, and the whole class of atypical antipsychotics has been tested and used in eating disorders, especially restrictive eating disorders, for quite a while. They're similar to SSRIs in that they have some desirable effects, but certainly aren't miracle treatments. In terms of doing R&D to bring new drugs to market, there's been a couple small attempts. One group was working on ghrelin, which is somewhat associated with this circuit. Ghrelin is a molecule that comes out of your stomach, and the layman's view would be it makes you hungry. So when your stomach is empty, it releases ghrelin and your brain decides it's time to eat. And they were making a ghrelin analog that would convince people who had anorexia to eat. They actually ran a trial on this at Mass General, I think in 2016, and they had okay results. But then the program refocused away from eating disorders and into cancer, and instead is focusing on other patient populations to use ghrelin as a drug. And I think that's something we see a bit, which is there's a lot more research going on in people who can't maintain their weight because they're being treated with chemotherapy, or the cancer itself is causing problems with cachexia, than we see in eating disorders. There's been a bit of a resurgence, and you'll see it in the press if you look at it, around psychedelics. And that includes MDMA, includes psilocybin, and that research has been kicking off into some clinical studies. The benefit for the folks who are making psychedelics into medicines for eating disorders is they don't have to go back and make a drug that has never been treated in humans before and give it to humans, because there's been plenty of exposure of these drugs. I think the challenge is that I don't think they've seen the improvements in all the anecdotal stories from people exposed that they can show that there is going to be a big miracle within the drugs. And they certainly don't target the feeding behavioral system. That they're much more associated because of their existing solutions around obsessive compulsive disorder. And so we'll see. And I'm as hopeful as anybody, honestly, as a parent, if those drugs work very well. And there's a study out of Johns Hopkins on psilocybin right now. If they work well, I would be ecstatic. But there's a lot of reason to be skeptical if that those are going to work.
How many people have this problem? How big is this market? I mean, it seems to me, the statistics I read, 9-10% of Americans have some kind of eating disorder. I don't know if that number's right or not. It's just something I read online. Could be true, could be not. Is there a large market for this solution?
Well, there's a lot of people with eating disorders, a lot of people with anorexia. So eating disorders, broadly speaking, includes anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and there's questions. So when you look at the market size, it might be easy to get confused of which eating disorder we're talking about. But if we were to focus just in on anorexia nervosa, there's, by statistics, 2 million people in the United States who've been diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. I think that may be deceptive in terms of how many people need significant pharmacological treatment. If you get down to the number of people who are admitted to hospitals each year, it's closer to the 15,000 person side. And if you're looking at the number of people who are admitted into residential eating disorder programs and things along those lines, it might be closer to 100,000 each year. But that being said, it's big enough not to be an orphan drug. So an orphan drug would be, I think, 5 in 10,000, some small number like that. And I think depending upon which populations really need the drugs and which ones can be treated, versus it's too complex, this could be a very large market for a product that helps a lot of people.
So where are you spending your time right now? What's the thing that you're focused on? I know all startups are trying to raise money, so that's not really what I'm asking. But what are you focused on in terms of getting to the next stage, hitting the next milestone? in the development process? What's the near-term objective for you?
Well, as you heard before, the goal of drug development is to find a drug, and we've been engineering towards the drug-like properties that fit our target profile for quite a while. And the big transition for us, the big pivot point, is when we can select the clinical candidates that show we're moving on from redesigning our compounds, and we're putting all our energy into building out those animal models to verify that it'll do what we want it to do. So we're laser focused on this drug discovery task of optimizing our compounds and building up as much evidence as we can to demonstrate that they're the ones we want. In some cases, it's looking for signals that they might have toxicity problems to be able to eliminate them. And we really are able to do a lot once we get to the next point, because that's when we can build up all of these next stage animal models in anorexia, animal models in larger animals than just a mouse, be able to test additional things. So, we're focused on that, optimize our compounds and figure out how to make them the best possible drugs as possible right now. We do have some opportunity. I remember I mentioned before, there's a lot of interest around cancer for things that can do what we're trying to develop. And the companies with oncology drugs are interested in licensing, or at least looking at licensing what we're working on. And so a dual purpose of us getting to those very strong drug candidates is to enable us to construct a pathway with a licensing deal with an oncology company. And so we have interest. We just have to be at a point which we can hand them the molecules with all of our intellectual property already posted around it, which means we have patents written, we have the supporting evidence from the research we've done, and that's going to be a big boost to the business as well as to the people we're trying to treat, because it gives us extra fuel in the tank from a financial standpoint, and at the same time, the ability for us to focus on treating eating disorders.
And I am not a biopharma specialist. I'm worse than a novice in this space. And so there's questions I should be asking you that I'm not. What should I be asking you about the business, about the solution, about where you are that I'm forgetting to ask?
I think most people will ask this really hard question, which is, how are you going to demonstrate that this works in humans such that it gets an FDA approval, and demonstrate that it works and has a benefit such that payers are going to pay money for it after it gets the approval for whatever size population you're treating at the price point you need to make a profit? Big question, right? So you can break it up into a couple pieces. We've put a lot of thought into what would a clinical trial look like for the drug we're building. We've worked with clinicians who are experts in treating anorexia nervosa already to give us recommendations of what might go into that clinical study and what would be the endpoints, the things we'd measure to show it was working. And we've come up with a couple key points. One, the first population we'd like to treat are the people who are in hospital settings, either the immediate hospital setting after someone gets admitted because of medical issues relating to eating disorders or anorexia, or the transition out to a lower level of care where they're still hospitalized, but they're no longer being stabilized for their medical issues. And the reasons for that is that we can efficiently measure a lot of things and control many variables that are harder to control for the people who are, living at home, being treated with outpatient therapy. And the other reason is we can measure things that are going to have big changes in that period if we have an impact, because those are the patients that have the highest acuity for all of these problems with thinking they're, obese even though they're highly underweight, or being terribly afraid of eating, or the time it takes for them to gain weight being impacted by their metabolism. And so our plan is to look in that population and show an impact both on the time to restore their weight, the time they would need to spend in these settings based upon their discharge criteria, to track them for a period of time to see if we can reduce readmissions and to look closely, especially at this metabolic factor around feed efficiency, to see if we can demonstrate that in people with anorexia and in recovery, because that alone would be enough for us to get an approval by the FDA. And so we're looking at it strategically of how we can get an approval. And that ties back to how we're designing and looking at the target profile and the preclinical studies we have to do now to give us confidence it's going to work in that clinical trial when we take it to a person. So that's one of the big pieces. And, we've also looked into what are the costs of anorexia nervosa that would justify paying for a drug that could be quite expensive to justify the research and development we have to put into it. And the good news is Deloitte and the Harvard and the eating disorders advocacy groups got together and did a full economic analysis of the impact of eating disorders in the United States that got published last summer. And the result of that publication basically shows, we're in the 50 billion range of total cost if we factor in everything, ranging from the medical cost, the people who are caring for the patients, the people who lose time off from work, and productivity costs. And if we just look at the medical piece, the impact is in the $1 to $2 billion range. And so there's plenty of opportunity economically to justify spend on a drug, both on the medical cost perspective, as well as on the quality adjusted life year type argument of the severe impact of a psychiatric disorder, which basically knocks you out of being able to operate and produces tremendous suffering for the people who have it. So we're pretty confident that with an approved drug, we'd find a premium price that would be paid for by commercial payers, and that not just in the United States, we could be able to do this in many of the other geographies that also struggle with the overall cost to society of eating disorders.
On a global basis, how would you quantify the problem?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the precise numbers of every country's eating disorder issues. There's been the most research in developed countries, especially ones that are in the British Empire. So there's a lot of research that comes out of the UK, a lot that comes out of Australia around the burden of disease for eating disorders. And they're roughly track on the same scales as the US in terms of numbers of patients out of a million. So the US is obviously about 8 to 10 times bigger than these places. But the global population is in the 7 billion range, and we're in the 300 million range in the US. So if we knocked off half of that, the not developed countries, and looked at just the developed countries, we'd be looking at a 10 to 15 million potential patient group who struggle with these diseases.
And is that big? I mean, is that big for a drug development business when you talk about the size of your market?
It's a healthy size, right? Big isn't always good. So, one of the biggest markets out there is obesity, but very few groups are interested in developing obesity drugs, because if you're intending your drug to go to huge populations, then the cost requires you to justify the safety piece that 50 million people are going to take your drug. What if it causes heart attacks, right? So, anything above 1,000 actually is fine. So, it's not a problem in terms of the scale. If anything, I'd say it's a tremendously big market compared to what most programs look at, but it's been ignored because nobody's thought it's possible to treat it.
How does stigma play into that? I mean, it seems like this is a really stigmatized problem set. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think there's general issues in terms of anybody wanting to talk about it. And I'll start with the people who have it, right? People with eating disorders don't talk about eating disorders. It's an embarrassing problem to have had and to struggle with. And it's inherently the kind of disease you hide with and you don't show people. The people who are trying to support folks with eating disorders like myself, it's really hard to communicate outwardly with it because we still live with our family members who struggle with these diseases and try and maintain our relationships. And talking publicly about someone else's sickness in your family can really hurt your family relationships. And at a deeper level, people with eating disorders commit suicide more than any other psychiatric disease. And people die from eating disorders more than any psychiatric disease. So those of us who are working with people in our family, and my daughter's struggled with self-harm and suicide attempts, we're worried we're going to push our loved ones into hurting themselves if we talk about this disorder and tell everyone it's a big problem and talk about our families. So I think you're not hearing what you should be hearing about anorexia nervosa. And if you want to hear about it, you got to go onto the right Facebook parent support group, and you'll hear an earful of people who are really struggling. And if you go outside to the broader community, and I'll blame myself and put myself in the category, most people are blissfully ignorant of the struggles of people with eating disorders. And they tend to look at it as a rich white teenage girl problem and more of a cosmetic issue than what it really is, which is a major psychiatric disorder. And so there's a big reframing that nobody's doing around anorexia, even though there's some minor attempts to it, which is, this is more like schizophrenia and autism than it is like a grouchy teenager. And I'm not sure how to fix it, right? Because, society cares about what it cares about.
Where would you point someone to get smart? Where are the right resources? Where would you point a parent or a loved one who wants to get good information about this problem and where they could start to learn more about how to deal with it if someone they love is struggling here?
So there's usually some local resources who will provide active support, meaning you can get someone on the phone and they'll be an advocate and help do some steering to find the right resource for your current problem. In our case in Massachusetts, there's a group called NEDA. And I think NEDA may even, it's a Massachusetts eating disorder group, may work beyond that space. There's also NEDA, which is the national group, and they have helplines and they field a lot of calls. I definitely recommend if someone's worried, reach out and talk to someone who can provide active support. But if you want to do research to understand what you can do and dive into what others have put out there, probably one of the best public resources is called Feast, which is a bulletin board as well as a group that produces curated content around eating disorders. They publish a what to do in the first 30 days when you're new to treating a loved one that has been diagnosed and has really been struggling. And Feast will provide quite a lot of information on it, as NEDA will also provide a lot of pointers to research that you can look at. And then I also would recommend, it's not too hard to find them, there's a couple Facebook groups out there, which are people who are, your peers. I think that's the best peer support comes from these Facebook groups and Feast, to sort of let the folks who have been doing this for a few years talk to the newbies who are just now starting to struggle.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that's probably a great start for people. In terms of research, like academic research, what are the good papers, the white papers? Where's the good research on this that people could find, hopefully publicly available, but if not, they could, probably try to find a way to get to it if they wanted to.
Yeah. There's a group out of, if you're interested in sort of just family-based therapy, there's a group out of UCSF that's done a lot of this research and published on the benefits of family-based therapy, including randomized clinical studies to put people on different therapy techniques. And that's run by Daniel LaGrange. And so you should look up Daniel LaGrange's work. He'll provide good research to show what has been effective. If you're looking for, the white papers are probably going to be put out from the eating disorder advocacy groups. They're the ones that are collecting up research on what's happening out there. There's a great article that was put out by Science Magazine just last year about how, it's time to really look at the biological basis of eating disorders rather than just think about them as behavioral things. And in many ways, it's frustrating for those of us who've been at this for a while because it's suggesting that it's some new revelation. But they did a fantastic job of diving into the evidence that there's a biological basis for eating disorders. I definitely look at that article as well. And it doesn't take far to do some searches. Google's a good resource for this stuff.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for educating me. And I really enjoy getting to know you and working with you in the fellowship program. And I'm excited about what you're doing. I really appreciate you taking time to come on and educate our audience and get people up to speed on this space, because I do feel like it's a little bit overlooked. And I think that it's unfair that that's the case. And I think we need to bring more attention to this problem set. And I think it's incredible what you're doing, your motivation for doing it. It's really commendable. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming on. And it's really been a pleasure, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Stephen. And, it's great that you're putting on these kinds of programs to get the word out for areas that are stigmatized.
Well, that's the mission. So I'm just grateful that people like you are working on it and are willing to come talk to us. So thank you again. I want to say another special thank you to Dan for being here today, for helping us to bring attention to this problem, helping to destigmatize it, and for his work in this space to bring a solution to market to help a lot of people who suffer greatly and don't have great answers. So I really admire what he's doing, and I'm grateful for him coming and sharing with us. To the founders out there, if you want to get engaged with What If Ventures, the What If Fellowship is a great way to do that. It's a program that we started recently. It's actually how we met Dan. It's a accelerator style program, 8-week program that helps startups go from having an idea or wherever they are in their early stage process to being ready to pitch to investors. And the program is focused solely on the mental health space. We bring a lot of CEOs and investors and others who are dedicated to this space to the program to be mentors and advisors. And I think we do a decent job of helping people get ready to go to market. So feel free to reach out to us there. To our listeners, thank you for being here. We would love your support on social media. Likes, follows, retweets, etc. are all great because it spreads our message and makes more people aware of our efforts to reduce stigma around mental health. And last but not least, we obviously would love to hear from you. You can reach out to us over email, info@stigmapodcast.com. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Instagram @stigmapodcast. And of course, you can find us on our website, stigmapodcast.com. And until next time, thank you for being here and stay safe.